Hello there! Welcome to Skepticism Productions. I'm Quam Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at what if Britain had never joined the EU. The point of departure in this video is going to be 1968. In 1968, there was a famous speech said by a very famous British politician called Enoch Powell. He made a very controversial speech in 1968 with regard to immigration. In that speech, famously known as the Rivers of Blood speech, he basically said that there was too much mass immigration coming to Britain and that it was causing problems with native people, and that it would be better if people voluntarily went home. That's the long and the short of it. So he was part of the shadow cabinet in Britain. Just for people who are not aware of this, so in Britain we have the cabinet, which the Prime Minister's part of, and all of his ministers, or his or her ministers, and then we have the shadow cabinet, which is basically the leader of the opposition and all of the people that they would appoint. So in the event of there being an election in Britain and the other side winning, they basically swap roles as such, right? So this is the nature of it. Enoch Powell was the shadow health minister. If he had gone into government, he would have been the health minister. And he was serving under someone called Ted Heath. Ted Heath was very liberal in more ways than one. His reaction to this speech, which hadn't been given approval by the cabinet in Britain, you have collective responsibility. So everyone in the cabinet has to all say the same thing. So you all speak with one voice. For Enoch Powell to come out and do this speech, which hadn't been approved by the rest of the cabinet and the rest of the cabinet hadn't even been fully made aware of, Heath was like, okay, no, this guy has to go, right? And also the nature of it did have incredibly inflammatory language. Some of it we won't repeat here, but you can certainly check it out for yourself. It did a lot to stir up racial tensions in Britain. At the same time, this was the first mainstream politician who had voiced any kind of concerns about immigration up to this period. So Enoch Powell, although the speech was quite incendiary in many parts, the first time there was a politician who basically spoke with the voice of the people, at least a large segment. In opinion polls at the time, something like in the region of 68 to 74% of people supported his speech. He was flooded with letters saying thank you, for what you've done. Thank you for taking a strong stance on this. We've been waiting for years for a politician to take this kind of stance. It's often been posited that if we had a presidential system, if in the 1970 election he had stood for president, he would have won with a landslide, because this was how popular he was. So Enoch Powell was sacked from the shadow cabinet. However, he still had a very, very big impact and had a very big following. When the 1970 election came about, Enoch Powell was the MP in a constituency near the British city of Birmingham. Around that area in 1970, there was an above average level of support that had gone from Labour to the Conservatives during that election, and that's often been attributed to the impact that Powell and his speech had, right? Because Powell was campaigning in those constituencies, and so it's been felt through research that the effect of that speech actually helped to make Ted Heath Prime Minister, which is quite ironic. The speech that you sacked someone for is probably the speech that made you Prime Minister. Ted Heath was a very interesting character, and he was a very, very passionate pro-Europeanist. For those who don't know, Britain didn't join the EEC, or which later became known as EU, until 1973. The EU had already been founded in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, but Britain had always stayed out from it. At that point of the EEC, or the Common Market as we'll refer to it in this video, it only consisted of 6 members. It's 6 founded members, which was France, Italy, Germany, and the Benelux countries. It had been said in the Treaty of Rome that they wanted an ever closer union. So they were basically heading towards, as Churchill had said in 1946 in the Zurich speech, which we mentioned in the previous video, he said that there ought to be a United States of Europe. However, it is noted, and we said this in the last video, Churchill didn't say that Britain should be part of it. He believed that Britain's empire should be elsewhere and stuff. The Conservative Party, starting with Churchill and following on from with all the subsequent leaders, were very pro-European. The Conservative Party, unlike now, was the party of Europe, right? And was very proud to be the party of Europe. The reason for that is because it was felt that by joining the EU, which was a free trade agreement, joining that bloc, it would be a thing where many of the regulations, many of the restrictions that have been put on things, maybe many of the tariffs between imports and exports would be lifted, and this would help in a way to liberalise the British economy and to make them more competitive with their European neighbours. The idea was essentially for us to join, but time and time time again, we've been blocked from joining, mainly by the French, who were at that point the dominant power. Charles de Gaulle famously said "non" twice. See, even then I can't really pronounce my French properly. So Britain had been trying to join the EU for a long time, and Powell, being a very staunch and loyal conservative, in 1961 he really wanted Britain to join. However, upon looking more into the actual Treaty of Rome and looking more into what the EEC, the European Economic Community, actually was, he started to become very skeptical of it and soon became the most strident opponent. The main problem that he had was the EU, as it would later become, it would subordinate Britain and subordinate British sovereignty to that of it being just another province, another state within this United States of Europe. If you think about this in American context, it would be the equivalent of Texas saying, we're fine by ourselves, we've been an independent country, but now we're going to join the United States, right? And we're going to lose a segment of our sovereignty, right? We're not going to be able to do trade deals, not going to be able to negotiate with foreign powers. We are going to basically give up our sovereignty to this federal system. For Britain, which had had a long history of 900 years since its last occupation, whereas all the other countries on the continent have been invaded multiple times by various different tyrants. So Britain had always maintained its sovereignty. It had a long history of limited government, which we've said in previous videos on the history of liberalism. Britain had a very clear sense of itself and its identity. Add on top of that the fact that we were an island nation. We always saw ourselves as being separate from the continent. People in Britain will often talk about Europe as if it's over there, which in geographical terms doesn't make sense, but culturally and historically and the way that we've always defined ourselves at very least since the break from Rome with Henry VIII as being separate from the continent. As a result of this, there was and always has been a very strong Eurosceptic strain within British politics. Enoch Powell, with his popularity with the Rivers of Blood speech, combined that with this kind of thing. He was one of the main voices for the anti-market forces. But Ted Heath, being the Prime Minister, was able to force through Britain's membership, and in 1972 to 73, that's the period in which Britain joined. Now, for a bit of historical context, Britain's sense of herself had been very much diminished after the war. It almost felt as if we, just like Germany, just like France, etc., that we had been defeated. Because looking about, it still felt as if we had been. All the countries which had been destroyed during the Second World War, Britain, although being one of the official victors, didn't seem to have gained that much. All the other countries on the continent seemed to be doing really great. They bounced back and were booming. We were kind of the sick man of Europe, as it was said, by the 1970s. We were lagging behind in productivity, in innovation. We simply weren't doing as well as our European competitors. Much of that actually is to do with the fact of we had a very burdensome tax system, which actually, if you look into it, we had the top rates of tax far above what actually was in France and Germany. So normally we would think of France and Germany as having higher levels of tax than Britain. Actually, during this period, our top rate of tax was 90+%, whereas in Germany and in France it was much lower than that. After the war, France and Germany actually liberalised their economy, whereas we nationalised our economy, and as we've mentioned in the previous video to Churchill, having nationalised industries might work for a time, but it does tend to lead to a lot of inefficiencies, because at the end of the day, government business can't go bust, whereas a private business can. So there's less incentive for them to innovate, there's less incentive for them to try new things and to be more efficient, right? Because at the end of the day, the taxpayer can always bail them out. With all that being said, Britain, being the sick man of Europe, having lost its empire, having lost its place in the world, was searching around and was thinking, right, what is our role? The answer seemed to be join the common market. This will be our lifeline, this will be our way of becoming a great power again. In 1973, we were able to join that. However, that tiny window of opportunity, as it were, for the pro-marketeers, before that, it would have been, we wouldn't have been able to join. After that period, where the economy started picking up, there was troubles in the 70s and in the 80s and stuff, don't get me wrong, but if we hadn't joined in that little period then, many people suspect that it would have been unlikely. The circumstances being such that it would have been very difficult. The argument for joining would have been very difficult. So imagine if in this timeline, Enoch Powell had been sacked and the public uproar was such that Ted Heath had to resign, and then there was a competition within the Conservative Party for for who would be the next leader. And if in that Enoch Powell, who had run before to be the leader, but now would have had this extra big following and this extra support throughout the country, I think that if that had happened, as unlikely as that would have been for Ted Heath to have actually stepped down, I think that Enoch Powell would have been the Conservative Party leader, and then he would have definitely won the 1970 general election. Now, Powell was a very interesting character. It's often been said that he was Thatcherism before Thatcher even was a Thatcherite. Now, that might sound very, very confusing to some people, but what we have to understand is that Margaret Thatcher was in favour of the economic theory known as monetarism. So this was about like free market, like economics. So we've discussed this in our videos on libertarianism, the history of it and the origins of it. So check those videos out. She was famous for coming in and privatising a lot of these nationalised industries, but also of changing the mindset that there had always been before with regard to economic policies. During the Keynesian era, it didn't really matter about deficits. Yeah, you can always like spend more, and you could always, through inflation, by changing the interest rate and increasing the supply of money, you could keep the economy going. By the late 60s, early 70s, this experiment started to really like run its course. The argument for monetarism, which was stable and like strong control of the money supply, i.e. stop printing so much money, and also like keeping interest rates like in check. And this was basically what monetarism was in the roundabout way. Powell was one of the leading voices for monetarism in Britain. Margaret Thatcher at this point hadn't even bought into free market economics yet. Like she was relatively centrist during this early period, and it was only during the 70s when she started to like reread a lot of like Friedrich von Hayek and like Milton Friedman, etc., and reading a lot of the things that like Powell had written. That was the point at which she started to really change her opinion on that. However, Enoch Powell was often a kind of loner in many regards. It was quite difficult to work with with many people. His view of Thatcher was basically, when he was asked about this, he was like something along the lines of like, if only she knew what it was in terms of monetarism and stuff. Yeah, like in terms of, he believed that what she ended up doing as Prime Minister wasn't actually anything of what he had actually advocated for. And by looking into what his policy stance were, we can quite clearly see how he would have differed from her. First of all, yes, he was in favour of privatisation, and yes, he was in favour of monetarism. However, he was pro-trade unions, whereas Thatcher took a very, very harsh line against them. All the kind of like industrial strifes that you would had in the 70s and the 80s would have probably been a bit smoother, because it wouldn't have been this clash of identities, this clash of like North versus South. He probably could have like made some reforms without it upsetting the unions to such a level. I don't think he would have kowtowed to them much as Ted Heath did, but I also don't think that he would have been over the top aggressive as Thatcher was. Thatcher very much saw it as being like as you said, like the enemy within. You know, there's no negotiating with an enemy, is there? So I think that Powell would have been able to achieve more without so much like kind of strife and without the lasting kind of bitterness that came from that. On top of that, he was also pro NHS, you know, being like that health minister and stuff. Yeah. Now Thatcher didn't privatise the NHS, although if she'd had the opportunity, she would have made it a privatised healthcare system, much as I said in the Churchill video of how, you know, the different models for healthcare systems. In that regard, Powell would have been different there as well. Also on top of that, he was pro-welfare state, and again Thatcher took a sledgehammer to that. His approach on welfare and like government like support in general would have been less like harsh than what hers was. But on foreign policy, he would have been very, very different. First of all, let's start with the situation in Ireland. Northern Ireland, you already had the Troubles, which kicked off in 1972. You could argue that it started like kind of in 1969. But like either way, like kind of certainly by 1972, it really kicked off, right, with the massacre on Bloody Sunday. The Troubles, which went from 1972 till 1998, that was a period of great level of turmoil, of terrorism, of absolute chaos and stuff. Yeah, Northern Ireland and in Britain. His stance was even harsher than the government's response would have been, because many people don't know this, but there was a referendum in 1975. So after we really joined, it was a referendum on whether we should remain within the common market or leave, and he took a very strong stance against that. After losing that, soon afterwards he ended up like leaving the Conservative Party. In 1974 election, he actually told people vote for Labour, and there's a famous thing where like, the party member in the audience who said he calls him a Judas, yeah, like called him a traitor. Powell said that Judas was paid I'm making a sacrifice. The issue for him about the common market was so important that he was willing to, this lifelong, staunch conservative who was willing to tell people to vote for Labour because at the 1974 election, the Labour Party was offering a referendum on the membership of the common market and the Conservative Party was against it. So that's how strongly he felt about this issue. Well, after Labour ended up becoming in power and they had that referendum and he still lost, he then ended up leaving the Conservative Party and became an Ulster Unionist Member of Parliament. He took a very strong stance that was pro-Unionist, so pro-Northern Ireland staying part of the United Kingdom. His stance with regard to the army being in Northern Ireland, what he said is that the army should not basically be impartial. They should not try to be this sort of police force. Their job is to go in there and destroy the enemy, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. What he would have done is he would have sent the troops in and really ruthlessly gone in and destroyed the IRA and as much as their support as possible. The Troubles, which were already pretty violent and pretty divisive in our time, would have been even more so if Powell had been Prime Minister. At the same time, on the rest of foreign policy, he was very, very different from any post-war Prime Minister we've ever had, because post-war Prime Ministers have been very pro-America and believed in the special relationship. He was more of the kind of old school, 19th century kind of splendid isolationism. What he was in favour of was for Britain to go about its foreign policy completely separate from the United States, because he believed that the United States was actually the rival power, a hostile power to Britain, rather than being a close ally. And he used the example of what they how the Americans interfered in Northern Ireland and with decolonization, etc., as a perfect illustration of that. He wanted more détente, which is more relaxation with the Soviet Union, and he said that Britain and Russia, which have always been on separate ends of the continent, were natural allies in terms of being able to maintain the balance of power on the European continent, because we're on both ends. We kind of see ourselves as European, but not really, and so we're able to keep the rest of the continent in check. He also was in favour of nuclear disarmament, which again for a conservative is quite strange. His stance on it was that the Americans have nuclear weapons, we have some nuclear weapons, we can't actually use by ourselves. Without America giving the go-ahead for it, we can't use these weapons independently. And on top of that, having these nuclear weapons makes us a sitting target in a nuclear war. Even without nuclear weapons, Russia is not going to be able to invade Western Europe and take over the world, because American forces and British forces would be able to defeat them on the battlefield. And this is what we kind of discussed in Operation Unthinkable video, which is that actually if there had been a conventional war between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, in a long war, probably the Western powers would have won in the end, just because they had better economic capabilities, etc. He said that long term, the nuclear weapons don't actually protect us. It's it's a phony kind of protection, really. This wouldn't have pleased the people in Washington DC very, very much. And on top of that, he was skeptical of the UN, and also, although being a very staunch imperialist and very much in favour of Britain remaining an empire, once Britain gave up its colonies, he said that, we should just completely, if we're not a colonial power, we should just give up everything, including the Commonwealth. So he would have been right, it's not our problem anymore, right? So for instance, in 1971, Idi Amin in Uganda kicked out all the Asians, and the Asians there end up coming as refugees to Britain. A, because of his immigration policy, and B, because of this new kind of anti anything to do with the empire kind of thing. He would have said, no, you're not coming to settle here. We want nothing to do with you. Go to India, etc., etc. Again, this is a very strong departure from anything that came from any other British Prime Minister. Every other British Prime Minister has been pro-nuclear weapons, pro-Commonwealth, pro-UN, pro-America, and anti-Soviet. So this would have been a very sharp departure from our own timeline. Now, how would Powell's premiership have affected immigration? Well, to be perfectly frank, it wouldn't have made much of an impact. Now, what I mean by that is this. Prior to 1997, net migration in Britain never exceeded 100,000 people a year. The era of mass immigration didn't actually really start with the 50s and 60s, as we with the Windrush generations we think of. In terms of mass migration, most of that has come within within my lifetime. Just to give an idea of this, net migration from 1950 to 2010 averaged about 40,000 people a year. So that gives you an idea as to just how small it was. Before 1997, around that period, what you see is that net migration is incredibly low. And in some years actually goes into the negatives, right? With the lowest being around like 1981 or like around like the early 80s. Partly as a result of the Immigration Act of 1968, I believe, and 1971 and 1981. I may have got some dates a little bit confused there, but apologies. With these immigration acts, kind of as a result, as a reaction to like Powell's speech, although there had been immigration acts like the one in 1962, which would also restrict things. So what we have to think of with regard to post-war immigration is this. In 1948, Nationality Act, I believe, this basically said that everyone within the empire could freely travel within the empire. So someone from Australia could move to London in the same way someone from London could move to Edinburgh, right? It's one country, it's one empire, it's fine. When the Labour Party made that law, they didn't suppose that what you'd end up having is a bunch of people from the Caribbean and from Africa turning up to the shores of Britain. So they were like, oh, okay, well, these people have turned up and what are we going to do with them? And we were like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. Like, we can get them to drive buses and to be nurses and doctors for the new NHS. And then it's like, okay, but like they're going to be here on a temporary basis, right? And then people stayed, and they're like, oh, well, we can't have more people like this coming. We didn't plan for this. And yeah, so the immigration policy was just all over the place, and actually, it's a good thing that it was, because it meant that I end up coming here. Like, it meant that my grandparents on my mum's side end up coming here, right? So one from Nigeria and the other one from Barbados, right? So it meant that my mum ended up being born here, and I end up being born here, and so as a result of the immigration policy and that hiccup, due to poor planning, I end up being born. So yay! But the general public was not in favour of this kind of immigration, and so subsequently they kept changing the laws to make it more and more that, for instance, if unless you had a grandparent who was born in this country, then it was a lot harder for you to come here, which, hint, if you've got a grandparent who was born here, that allows you to come here if you're from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. So basically all the white places, right? So it basically was a big kind of, we don't want any more people of colour to come here. Net migration after the war wasn't actually as high as we thought it was, and actually by the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, it was actually pretty low. However, a major difference would have been not in who would be coming in, but who would be going out. Powell, as we said, was in favour of voluntary repatriation. So this meant that he wanted to encourage people who had come here to leave, basically. So he's like, right, okay, please go back to kind of where you came from and stuff. You can come here as a temporary basis to be nurses and doctors and stuff, but we don't want you to stay here. We don't want you having kids here. Just come here, do your bit, and then leave, please. Powell was already in favour of voluntary repatriation. Even without him being Prime Minister, his speech, unintended, right, because that wasn't the kind of sort of person he was, but it was unintended in the sense of what it ended up leading to is it gave a green light to all the real racists and skinheads and stuff, much as, well, unfortunately I end up looking like. One of my best friend texted me the other day being like, oh, this new haircut, you end up looking like the guy from American History X. Anyway, but they're probably not the best timing of this video, but anyway, there was already the National Front, and all these kind of organisations which were founded after that period, which committed a lot of hate crimes against immigrants here, killing people, burning houses, putting feces through letterboxes, all those kind of stuff, right? Really horrible stuff. And so if that had already happened in our timeline, there would have been even more of that, because it would have been a thing where it would have felt even more sanctioned. People would have been like, oh, okay, cool, the Prime Minister even is saying for you not to go, why are you still here? And I think that race relations in Britain would have been much, much worse during this time. I don't think everyone would have left, but I think quite a lot of people would have left because it would have been so uncomfortable, and the communities that did stay would have felt very ghettoized, because Britain, like unlike France and many other places, yeah, and like unlike America even, is not a racially segregated like country. Beyond a few neighborhoods and stuff like in Britain, for the most part, immigration in this country has been relatively open, and people have like mixed and integrated quite well, and you know, people have generally got on. I feel that like there would have been an even more of an in-group, out-group kind of mentality, and if this had happened, and I think that people would have been very defensive, like the immigrant communities would have been very defensive, and I think that the majority, like a white population, would have felt even more unwelcoming to them. Like I can't say with any accuracy what would have really happened like kind of in Britain during this time. For instance, does Margaret Thatcher win the 1979 general election? Maybe not. Like we said in the previous video, the end of history, talk about the pendulum theory of history. Like if the Conservatives are in for a while, then Labour tends to get in, and vice versa. Could Powell have stayed on as Prime Minister from 1970 till 79 and then Thatcher take over? I don't know. Like so many things like would have been different. Like the economy would have been different. Like if you'd had a lot of like denationalisation and like liberalisation of the economy in the 70s as opposed to in the 80s, would there have been as much of a need for Thatcher? Maybe, but probably not. Then when she got in, then she would have done a complete 180 with regard to foreign policy. And also as well, we have to remember that power is one person, and like we said, it's cabinet responsibility, it's a parliamentary system, so the rest of the Conservative Party, that's smooth, wouldn't necessarily have gone along with his vision for foreign policy. So there's so many things to consider with this, so we're going to stop that part of the timeline here. But I'll tell you what, we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop making these great videos here, yeah, for you, the consumer. Every single one of these videos, put a lot of work into, and I hope that you share this with people, that if you haven't subscribed already, that you subscribe. And of course, hit the like, you know, dab on the haters. Okay, you got to dab on them haters, yeah. And I've seen a lot of people have started liking my videos a lot more, which is good, because it shows that like you're actually supporting me and stuff. Oftentimes, haters will try and be like, yo, we'll try and get you down, but you know, they don't want you to win. They don't want you to succeed. They don't want you to watch great content. So if you want to keep watching great content, you got to hit the like button, baby. No one wants. You got to hit them likes. Get them likes up, man. Get your gains up, cuz. Get them likes up, cuz. You know what I'm saying, cuz? Anyway, like, just hit the like button. Please do. Okay? Now, for a video about the EU, we've not actually spoken that much about the EU, which some people might be a bit disappointed on. So this is what this segment of the video is going to be about. We're not going to get into a lot of the kind of debate about Brexit, etc., but within it, we have to look at some key facts. Britain, since the time it joined to the time it's now leaving, has always been a net contributor to the budget of the EU. One important thing to recognise is that Britain has put in a net of about £200 billion into the coffers of the EU. So that's us putting more money in than we've been given back in terms of subsidies or grants or as part of the rebate. If we add up that, that's an extra £200 billion, which could have been spent in Britain on whatever it wants to be spent on, and it also would have freed us up to do a lot more other things. Now, there's an argument of if we hadn't been in, would we have had the same access to trade? Would our economy have been as good? Some arguments to say that we would have been in a worse financial situation if we hadn't joined, and that us joining helped boost a lot of the productivity and growth that came in the 70s and 80s. We're not going to get into that at this time, because there's a degree of debate about that and a degree of speculation. If Britain had a free trade deal with the EU, then a lot of those things probably could have been like eased over. And actually, the EU ended up having a lot of free trade deals with other countries, partly because of our influence within it. The effect that it would have had on Britain itself wouldn't have been as big as people suppose it would have. So, who's running the hot tap? Anyway, it wouldn't have had as big of an effect as we might have supposed, because at the end of the day, the EU, for all that there's been debate about it, hasn't had that much of an impact on Britain. With regard to immigration, for instance, mass migration from the EU came in the period from about 2004 onwards, with the Eastern European countries joining the common market. If we'd never been in, there might have been slightly less migration like from EU countries. Other than that, there wouldn't have been as much of an impact as people would have like supposed. Brexit was always about money, laws and borders. So as we said, the money side of it we would have had net 200 billion, assuming all else being equal. The laws, 97% of all laws that the EU passed were agreed by the British Parliament. There wouldn't have been that much difference there, and the laws that were imposed haven't really had that big of an impact on Britain. Certainly some of the regulations, maybe you could argue that economic growth might have been greater if we hadn't had those regulations, or it might have been worse. Like, a lot of this is kind of speculative. And then in terms of borders, obviously with immigration, we wouldn't perhaps have had as much mass migration in the last like 10-15 years if this timeline had gone differently. But I don't really see as much of an impact on Britain itself. However, for the EU itself, I think it would have had a much bigger impact. And that's not to say that the EU needs Britain more than Britain needs the EU, but it's just a fact of Britain's influence during its time of being a member has been quite decisive. If we look at the original 6 countries, they have always wanted to head more towards federalisation, of centralisation, of ever closer union, and Britain has always been the fly in the ointment, as it were. Has always been the one who's held that back. Has always been the one that slowed the progress towards that. We opted out of Schengen, we've opted out of the euro, we opted out of so many different things because of us being a restraining force on that path towards federalisation. It's meant that the rest of the EU has had to kind of accommodate us in some regard. So they have changed their approach, always having to bear us as the most sceptical and most powerful sceptical nation in mind. Without us being in there, probably would have meant that they would have headed towards federalisation a lot sooner. Yeah, they probably might have had an EU army by now. It probably would have headed a lot more like in that direction, and we wouldn't have had to negotiate as much. A little known fact by many people is that in the 1960s and 70s, there were 2 competing European trading blocs. Britain was part and one of the founding nations of EFTA, European Free Trade Association. Us being a founding member, we made up a huge chunk of their economy. For my calculations, it's roughly about a third of the total GDP. We were very influential within that bloc, and we set up that bloc along with many other countries as a opposing bloc. So there was the Outer Seven, which was Britain, Denmark, Austria, Portugal, Sweden, Norway. I said Denmark, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but Finland as well, I believe. You had the Outer Seven, which we were part of, and then you had the Inner Six, which was the what became the EU. If Britain hadn't left EFTA to then go and join the EU in 1973, I think that a lot of other countries wouldn't have done that either. Denmark, for instance, joined the EU at the same time as us, so it left EFTA and joined the EU. Sweden and Austria both left EFTA and joined the EU in 1995. Portugal joined in 1986, I believe. Quite a lot of countries end up joining the bloc that thinking, well, okay, so France and Germany and Italy are already part of it, and now Britain's part of it. Now this is the kind of in club, there's no serious competing bloc. For us to be fully European, we're going to have to join this bloc. You see Spain join, you see Greece join, and then with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, you then start to see that from 2004 onwards, you start to see a lot of Eastern European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, kind of Hungary, all these places joining the bloc. I think that if Britain hadn't left EFTA, quite a lot of those countries would have actually preferred to have been part of EFTA, because EFTA is just focusing on free trade. There's no parliament, there's no trying to like centralize things. It's literally just a free trade association, right? And member states can operate as they want. And countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, which we're seeing in the news now, causing lots of kind of problems for the EU because the EU's imposing laws on them and they don't want those laws, etc. I think that if they'd had 2 choices of 2 different blocs, I think they would have chosen the bloc which would have been less interfering in their domestic policy. And so as a result of that, I think that what you could potentially have had is, say for instance, you had the 6 founding members of the EU, Spain, probably Greece, and then I think most of the rest of Europe, so all of Scandinavia, most of Eastern Europe being part of EFTA. Yeah, I think Britain would have been very powerful and influential within EFTA, And I think that France and Germany would have been very influential within the EU, more so even than they are today. Because while a lot of the policies within the EU have been very Franco-German in their orientation, I think without Britain also being within the top three, I think that the policy of the EU would have been far more orientated towards this Franco-German axis. That's a very different kind of Europe that we can imagine. I'm not necessarily going to say that this is what Europe would have been like. I think that given all the information like that we have, I think that it's likely that you had these blocks. At the same time, there's nothing to say that those countries in Eastern Europe and all the other places that eventually joined the EU wouldn't have eventually joined anyway. In the next video, we're actually going to go off of the alternative history series for a little bit, because we just need to cover what I think are the top 10 countries to leave the EU. I'm not saying that they will. It's not looking at necessarily opinion polls. It's saying that if any of these top 10 countries were to leave, which are the ones which have the strongest economic argument for leaving. So barring everything else, just looking at economics, looking at trade, looking at net contribution, etc., and seeing which countries could feasibly leave if they wanted to and could probably get along quite fine. So this timeline is very, very different than the time that we have. Britain would have been very different domestically because of what Enoch Powell kind of would have brought through, and Europe would have been very different in terms of which nations would have been in the EU and which ones wouldn't have been. We're going to probably stop the timeline there because there's so many different variables, there's so many differences. Again, with the butterfly effect, it starts to become quite disorientating. So I'm not going to kind of speculate like this is what the world will look like now in 2020, because you're talking about a period of like 50 years with completely different people, completely different policies. For me to speak more on it would be getting into the realms of absurdity. So with that being said, hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, definitely stay tuned for the next video, which on the EU, and yeah, check out some of our other videos as well. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.